Hello, my friends, and welcome to another week of Uncle Henny's Campfire Stories. So excited to have many of you join us tonight. This is, I believe, our 17th live stream in a row. We've been doing them every single Wednesday, 8 o'clock Eastern, and it's been something I've been able to look forward to every single week. So please, if you're just joining us, make sure to jump into the chat room and leave a funny comment. I'll be reading stories from Scary Stories for Sleepovers, number 10. The final book in the series. We've read through 9, count them, 9 books in the Scary Stories for Sleepovers series. And this one, Scary Stories for Sleepovers number 10, was the hardest one to find and the most expensive one. But thanks to you guys and your generous tips and donations, I was able to obtain a copy. So we'll see if it was worth the price, but I think it was. So this week we'll read about half of this, and then next week we'll read the other half. Let's see what's going on in the chat. And real quick, the winner of first tip was Ray Cersei. And boy, did she win by getting a head start. But immediate runner-up was Craig Cohen. Thank you both for your generous tips, not only this week, but every single week. Very much appreciate it. It definitely puts a smile on my face to read to you guys for a little while and then have a little something extra to buy groceries. Or last week I bought video games. I bought Just Cause 4, and I played the heck out of it over the weekend. Let's see who's in the chat. Craig Cohen, hello Henrik, good evening. Good evening to you, my friend. Tony Marr said, the final countdown. Thank you, Tony. Ray Cersei said, hello. Hey. Morgan Moore said, evening all. Keith Tomlin said, hello, you glorious SOB. Yo. Raymond Lawson said, hi. Hello, sir. Jeff McClellan said, hello. Hello, Jeffy. Dwayne West said, hello, my good friend. Hey, Dwayne, good to see ya. Ray Cersei, LMFAO, well, you know, brush his shoulders. Well, you know, you can't help it. You're the tough one. You're the bad whoa, I almost swore. I try to keep it family friendly as humanly possible. But I want to thank you all so much for joining me every single week. It's been a lot of fun. Oh, Henwolf just entered the room. I don't know what she's doing. You okay, big girl? I wish you guys could see her. She's just pacing around my chair like the shark from Jaws, except much more deadly. Oh, David Denoyer said, yo-ho. Craig Cohen said, how's Chicano now? Recovering well. Chicano is doing very well. Today he had his teeth cleaned, and he had one tooth extracted, a very small tooth. It was no big deal. The root had already died, so it just needed to be popped out. He'll be back on regular kibble tomorrow. He's doing well. He was super excited to see me and super excited to get in the car and go home. But he is definitely a little on the stone side. He's just kind of looking intensely at things around the house and not quite napping, which is how Henwolf was when she came back from her surgery. She didn't seem to want to nap, even though normally she would nap all the time. She, had no desire to nap after her surgery, so I'm guessing the medication will wear off and he'll be back to his normal nappy self in no time flat. So, but I guess it's about time we start our first story. Let me get a little bit of this going. Oh, come on. It just sealed itself. Good stuff. All right. Oh, before we start, thank you, Shane Migliavaca, for your generous tip. I do appreciate it very much. It came in right before I started the first story. Thank you so much, Shane. Tipping is not required, but it is greatly appreciated. Definitely puts a little extra skip in my step. Also, sharing is scaring, so hit the share button and let people know you're watching Scary Stories with friends and you're hanging out and having a good time and you want them to join you. Shane Migliavaca said, aw, about the dogs, I'm guessing. Keith Allen said they like looking at all the colors. And Tony Marr said, tonight's rundown, kids being murdered, ghosts, carnies. Well, we're about to find out, and I think that, Tony, that was a perfect segue for us to start our first story from Scary Stories for Sleepovers, number 10, The hard-to-find one, the one that I had to actually... Every single book in the series cost me like $5 to $6, but this one was a whopping $50 after shipping. So, without further ado, it's time. All right, my friends, the first story is called The Crispy Hand. Rich and Tommy had heard the tale a million times, every time they visited their grandmother. When they were younger, it used to keep them up at night, but Tommy was 12 now, Rich 14, and they were tired of hearing about the crispy hand. However, the story was a tradition and unavoidable. So after an excellent dinner of ham and Grandma's secret recipe mashed potatoes, and after Rich and Tommy had done the dishes, the boys gathered in the living room where their mother and grandmother were drinking tea. "Tommy, would you throw another log on the fire, please?" his grandmother asked. She gave him a sinister smile. "You'll want all the light you can get after you hear the story of the crispy hand." Tommy restrained himself from rolling his eyes as he moved to the wood bin. He fed the fire a split chunk of oak and then sat on the hearth to enjoy the heat. Rich sat with their mother on the sofa. Grandma was in her chair close to the fire, an afghan wrapped around her legs. She held her teacup and saucer in her lap, where they occasionally rattled from her trembling. "A long, long time ago," she began, "something bad happened in this very town." Rich mouthed the words along with her. Tommy had to put his hand over his mouth to keep from laughing. Their mom knew how tired they were of this story. They had complained about it all afternoon during the car ride, but she told them to show respect to their grandmother and listen. Their mom nudged Rich to make him stop, and Tommy focused on Grandma so he wouldn't be tempted to laugh by watching any further antics from his brother. "Before I was born, when most of the land around town was still forest, the townspeople were very suspicious of outsiders. Back then, people didn't travel as much as they do today. You didn't just hop in your car and drive 4 hours to see your grandma. You saw more horses on the road than automobiles, and there were no aeroplanes. Our town was 10 miles from the nearest railroad line, so not too many strangers passed through these parts. And when they did, the townsfolk made good and sure to find out their business and keep an eye on them." Tommy risked a glance at Rich, but was behaving himself now, becoming engrossed in the story despite himself. "One day, as dusk was thickening into night, the town constable got word that there was a stranger walking on the forest road toward town. A farmer heading into town had spotted the man, large and hairy like a bear, and word spread through the small town like wildfire. So the constable and his deputies rode out to meet this stranger. The constable rode a fine chestnut mare. The two deputies followed with the police wagon hitched to a team. They had no problem finding the stranger. He was walking along the side of the road just as they'd been told. However, he wasn't the bear of a man they expected. He was tall, yes, but his big coat hung on him as if he were made of broomsticks. His dark hair hadn't been cut in a long time. Between it and his thick facial hair, he did look a lot like an animal, but not a fierce one, just a tired and hungry one. The constable pulled up in front of the man. Letting the stranger get a good look at his rifle, he asked his name and his business. The stranger stared wearily, then shook his head. The constable raised his voice and asked again. The stranger held out his empty hands in a deep, rough voice, said something in a language the constable did not understand. Neither did his deputies. So the constable ordered his deputies to lock up the man in the police wagon. The stranger didn't understand as they stepped warily toward him. But when they tried to grab him, he struggled fiercely. However, he was no match for the two strong deputies, and they locked him in the police wagon. "We'll let him spend the night in jail," the constable said. "Tomorrow we'll let him loose a few miles up the Barnesville Road. That'll let him know his kind ain't welcome here." The deputies knew this routine well. That's what they did with any stranger who came to their town without a darn good reason. So they drove the wagon back to the jail, which in those days was an old timber building that had been around longer than any other building in town. They used to say that the rebels locked up British loyalists there during the Revolutionary War. It was a squat building made of rough-hewn logs that had turned black with age, and it had crude iron bars over the windows. It was old, but it did the job. Kind of like me. Tommy and the others smiled at the familiar joke. The deputies did as they were told. They took the stranger to the jail and locked him up, the only prisoner there. Grandma paused to sip her tea. What a horrible place to stop, Tommy thought, knowing what came next and wishing she'd get it over with. Grandma took a second sip of tea, then resumed the story. No one knows how the fire started, but in a wooden building of that age, it came as no surprise. It was cold that time of year, and the heat came from an old coal stove. Maybe a stray ember landed on the roof, or maybe a bird had made a nest in the chimney, or maybe one of the deputies had been careless with the stove door, allowing a spark to jump out. The cells were full of old straw for prisoners to sleep on. That straw made good tinder, and before you knew it, that old wooden jail was one big bonfire. As soon as someone spotted the fire, they rang the church bell. In those days, everybody in town dropped whatever they were doing and came to fight a fire. There were no hydrants or fire trucks, so they had to use buckets. They formed long lines stretching from well pumps to the fire. Then they passed the full buckets along the line and the empty ones back. Not the best way to fight a fire, but the best they could do. They tried to save the jail, but it was just burned too fast. Even with 4 lines feeding buckets of water, it was like spitting on a campfire. But they tried, and all the while the townspeople could hear the strange foreign shouts of the stranger in his cell. Finally, the heat became too fierce, and they couldn't get close enough to throw their buckets of water on the flames. It was a lost cause, and they all knew it. Somberly, they watched the jail burn. From one window, a hand reached through the bars, grasping at life and freedom. Its fingers clutched and strained as the horrified people watched. Strange foreign screams rose from the heart of the blaze. Tommy decided he was warm enough and moved away from the fireplace to sit on the sofa with Rich and his mom. The next morning, the jail was nothing more than smoking ash and cinders, Grandma continued. The constable and his deputies sifted through it, but found no sign of their prisoner, not even the hand that had tried so hard to reach freedom. With nothing to bury, they shrugged and started to clean up the mess. They had a new jail to think about. They forgot all about the stranger, whom they had, in a manner of speaking, murdered. The night, as one of the deputies lay in bed, he heard something. He lived by himself and had no pets, but he could tell something was in the house with him. He heard a soft scuffling across the bare wood floor. Mice, he thought. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would get some traps, but tomorrow would never come for him. For a few moments later, something locked around his throat. The thing seemed thin and brittle, but its grip was superhumanly strong. The deputy could not breathe. He tried to pry the thing free, but it clung too tightly. The constable found his body the next day when the deputy didn't show up for work. He was in bed with the sheets and blankets all thrown about. His bloodshot eyes bulged from his face and his bloated tongue protruded from his mouth. The oddest thing was what showed on his bruised neck. A set of sooty marks that looked as if they'd been made by the fingers of one hand. Tommy found himself rubbing his neck, imagining the feel of charred fingers digging into soft flesh. Well, Grandma continued, the constable knew what people would think if they found out about the soot marks, so he kept that quiet. He was not a superstitious man, and he knew there had to be some other explanation. Maybe the dead stranger had friends in the area who were trying to get revenge for his death. This seemed more plausible, than the man's charred hand running around killing people. So he got his other deputy and some of the townsmen, and they rode around looking for strangers. But they found none. That night, the second deputy, mourning the death of his friend, walked aimlessly around town, reeling from the shock. He was walking home after midnight when his scream broke half the town. Lanterns flared to life as people rushed to their windows to see what was going on. They saw the deputy lying face down in the street. Those who got to him first, including the town doctor in his nightshirt, rolled him over. His dead eyes were wide with fright, and his throat was streaked with soot. The next day, stories of the crispy hand were all over town. It crept the streets at night, they said, and would not rest until its murderers had all felt its sooty grasp. The constable redoubled his efforts to find a real human culprit, but again, he failed. By that evening, he was starting to have his doubts. Superstitious or not, all this talk about the crispy hand had him rattled. He was the only one left of the three who had locked up the stranger, and the sun was going down. He was scared. So when his wife said that she was ready for bed, he told her to go up without him. Then he made himself a full pot of strong black coffee. He made himself comfortable at the table and covered his lantern. In the darkness, he drank coffee to stay awake, keeping one hand on his gun. After midnight, he was starting to feel drowsy despite all that coffee. But then he heard a soft thump from the fireplace, and he was instantly wide awake, with all his senses focused to razor sharpness. It came down the chimney, he thought. He heard it scuttle through the ashes and scrabble across the hearth. Suddenly he threw back cover of the lantern, and there it was. Grandma made a sweeping gesture, and Tommy and the others flinched. Grandma had to grab her teacup to keep it from toppling. The crispy hand was poised there on its fingers like some hideous five-legged spider. As soon as the constable rose from his chair, it skittered into the darkness behind the coal stove. Warily he approached, with the lantern dangling from one hand and his revolver in the other. The hand scuttled away from the light, circling the stove. The constable gently holstered his revolver and picked up the tongs from the stove. The tongs clacked as he tested them, like giant iron tweezers. Then he set the lantern on the floor and began to circle the stove. The crispy hand retreated from him as before, but seemed wary of the light from the lantern. As it seemed to hesitate, trapped between the constable and the lantern, the constable lunged. The tips of the tongs closed on the crispy hand. He lifted it from the floor and moved it closer to the lantern. Both fascinated and repulsed, he studied it in the light. A human hand, charred and blackened by fire, its skin flaked and mostly gone. But the most grotesque thing was the way it moved. Its fingers thrashed as if madly playing some invisible piano. Suddenly, the constable could bear looking at the thing no longer. He threw open the door of the coal stove and thrust the hand in along the glowing red embers. Most horrible of all, it wouldn't burn. Its fingers seemed to calm as they stirred the embers. Then it just sat there in that infernal heat, as if waiting. The constable, growing angry with frustration, pulled out the hand and smashed it against the floor. He held it there with the tongs and stomped on it with his boots. But it did no good. The crispy hand seemed to be indestructible. He glared at the hand and cursed it. "You'll not kill me, evil thing," he vowed, and then he came up with a plan. If he could not destroy the hand, he could at least contain it so that it would not be able to creep up on him in any moment of vulnerability and strangle him, as it had his two deputies. So he put the hand into a stout wooden chest and slammed the lid closed before it could scramble out. Then he locked the chest and hid it away where no one would find it. And that Grandma said, glorying in the conclusion of her tale, is how the crispy hand came to be locked in the attic of this very house. That night, Rich and Tommy slept in twin beds in the guest room. At home, they had their own rooms and liked it that way, but sleeping in the same room was fun once in a while. Tommy had his pen light, and they made shadows on the wall for a while. Then they spent a long time talking and laughing in the darkness. However, they stopped suddenly when they heard a skittering sound overhead. Ooh, Tommy said, do you think it's the crispy hand? Rich snorted. No, I think it's leaves blowing across the roof. Do you think it really happened? That someone died in the fire like Grandma says? Maybe. She must have gotten the idea for the story somewhere. But you know what? I think I figured out why she tells us that stupid story every time we come here. Why? Tommy's shown his penlight in Rich's face. Get that thing out of my eyes or I'm not going to tell you. Tommy turned off the light. So why? To keep us out of the attic. Think about it. As scared as we used to get about the crispy hand, we never would have dared going up there. Yeah, Tommy said, seeing his brother's point. But why wouldn't she want us to go up there? That's just it. That's the real question. What's up there she doesn't want us to see? As far as I know, nobody's been up there for years. Grandma certainly couldn't make it up there. If she went to all the trouble of making up that stupid story, whatever's up there's gotta be pretty good. I guess we could go up and look, Tommy said, throwing back his covers. The trapdoor is in the closet in this room, and I've got my penlight. He flashed it in Rich's eyes again. Turn that stupid thing off or I'm going to shove it down your throat. Tommy turned it off, snickering. We can't go up now, Rich said. Mom and Grandma would hear, and we don't want them to know we were in the attic, right? Right, Tommy agreed. So we'll wait until tomorrow, Rich went on. Mom and Grandma are planning to go to garage sales all morning. We can say that we want to stay here and build a fort in the woods or something. While they're gone, we can spend as much time looking around the attic as we like. It's a pretty good plan, Tommy said. Sometimes you can be pretty bright. He flashed the light in his brother's face again. That's it. You're dead. The boys, not wanting to go to garage sales, came as no surprise to their mother, but she was still reluctant to leave them behind. What are you going to do here all by yourselves? She asked. Watch TV, eat, mess around in the woods, Rich said. Same stuff we do at home. I don't want you two horsing around in your grandmother's house and breaking things. Nah, we won't, Tommy said. We'll only break things outside. Their mother sighed and looked at Grandma. See what I have to put up with? Be glad you didn't have boys. Grandma snorted. No two boys could have been as big a handful as you and your sisters. It's okay if they stay here. They won't get into any mischief. Right, boys? The boys were reassuring as they hustled the two women out of the house. They watched through the window until the car was out of sight. Let's go, Tommy said, racing for the closet that held the trapdoor to the attic. He got to the hallway before he realized his older brother wasn't following. What are you waiting for? I was just thinking about the way Grandma looked at us. She trusted us not to cause any trouble. We're not going to cause any trouble, Tommy said. We're just going to go up into the attic and look around. Then a grin spread across his face. Unless you're scared. Think the crispy hand is going to get you? They stared at each other for a moment. Then they both ran for the guest room. Rich caught up to Tommy on the stairs and practically ran over him to get there first. They opened the closet packed with old coats and clothes wrapped in plastic. Above the hanger rod was a wooden shelf holding a few dusty boxes. In the ceiling was the trap door. Rich and Tommy got a chair. With help from his brother, Tommy climbed from the chair and got one foot on the shelf in the closet. Then he pulled himself up until he could push through the trap door and poke his head into the attic. It was a lot warmer up there and smelled like an old sweater. A little light came through a vent at one end, but it was mostly dark. "Get out of the way," Rich said as he lunged through the trapdoor. For a moment, they were both wedged there until Tommy wriggled free. Then he got out his penlight and shined it around. The bare rafters came together overhead and sloped down toward the front and rear walls of the house, like an upside-down V. The floor was made of planks laid across the rafters below, although they were hard to see through the clutter of the boxes and junk. "So what is it we're not supposed to see?" Tommy asked. "I'm not sure," Rich said. "Shine that light over here." "Not in my face." There were bundles of old magazines and newspapers, an antique sewing machine, boxes of glass jars, coffee cans full of rusty nails, mottled paint cans, plug-in plastic Santa Claus, ancient suitcases, and a manual typewriter. The boys looked through it all, but found nothing promising until they came across an old military footlocker that had their great-grandfather's name and U.S. Army stenciled on it. "Cool," Tommy said. "What do you think's in it?" "How should I know?" Rich went to open it, but found it locked with a hasp and an old rusted padlock. He grabbed the lock and twisted. It came off in his hand. "Whoa, look out, Superman!" Tommy shouted. "It was so old it just fell apart," Rich said, shaking the rust off his hand. Then he pulled the hasp open and lifted the lid. Both brothers leaned forward to peer in. The beam of the penlight showed them. Nothing. "It's empty," Tommy said with disappointment. Rich grabbed the penlight and probed every corner, but the only thing he found was a hole in one side a few inches across. "Looks like rats took whatever was inside." Tommy heard a soft thump from the closet beneath the trapdoor and froze. He could tell from the look on Rich's face that he heard it too. "Mom and Grandma?" Tommy whispered. "They shouldn't be back this soon," Rich replied in similarly hushed tones. "But if they catch us up here..." Rich and Tommy scrambled back through the trapdoor, got it closed, shut the closet door, and put the chair back. Then they investigated the mysterious thump. However, the house was now completely quiet, and the car was still gone from the driveway. They decided something must have fallen over and went outside to play in the woods. The boys' mother and grandmother didn't get back until late that afternoon with a car full of bargains. After unpacking and examining their purchases, they took the boys out to dinner, then to the movies. It was late by the time they got home, and after the long day they all had, they soon went to bed. Tommy was exhausted and didn't have the energy to zap his big brother with his penlight one more time before falling asleep. But not long after dozing off, he was awakened by a scuffling sound on the rug near his bed. A lifetime of hearing about the crispy hand electrified him with fear. He scrambled for his penlight and flashed it wildly across the floor. And there it was, just as Grandma had always described. The crispy hand was poised there on its fingertips like some hideous black spider. Its charred skin glistened under the light, and it retreated a little. When Tommy noticed something else taking shape behind it, he was reluctant to move the flashlight beam off the hand, but it turned out that he didn't need to. The figure materializing in the center of the room glowed with a light of its own, a pale and eerie illumination like moonlight. It was a man, tall and hairy and clothed in a bulky coat that was hung poorly on his thin frame. Tommy recognized him from the story. It was the stranger who had died in the jail. With still mouth-mounting terror, Tommy realized that the right sleeve of his coat hung empty. The stranger looked right at Tommy and smiled. Too frightened to move, Tommy watched as the stranger crouched down to the crispy hand. His empty sleeve brushed against it, and a ghostly hand emerged and joined with the man's arm. The crispy hand crumbled into a small pile of ash. The stranger stood, flexing his newly rejoined hand, and, after one more smiling at Tommy, faded away into nothing. It was a minute before Tommy could even move. He just laid there, frozen in fear, his penlight shining on the spot where the crispy hand had been. Finally, he snapped out of it. "Rich, wake up! Did you see that?" Getting no response, he shined the penlight in his brother's face. But this time, he received no threats or warnings. Rich did not move to shield his face. His bulging eyes did not so much as blink as they stared lifelessly at the ceiling. His slack mouth hung open, and his neck was streaked with sooty finger marks. Suddenly, Tommy knew why the ghostly stranger had been smiling. The crispy hand had been unable to kill the constable all those years ago and complete the stranger's revenge. But tonight, it was finally able to fulfill its mission of vengeance by killing the constable's great-grandson instead. Ooh, I thought this was going in a cute direction of like, oh, he just wanted his hand back to end the curse. But no, child death. Let's see what you guys are saying in the chat. That was a good one. I like that one. Definitely a strong start to the final book. Okay. Let's see what you guys are saying. Ooh, we got a whole bunch of you in the chat tonight. Thank you so much for joining me. Shane McLaughlin said, haha, yes, I hope there's more carnies. Ray Cersei said, I hope they don't deep fry it. Morgan Moore said, I guess the author didn't like famous recipe. I think we're going to have a lot of food jokes coming this way. Tony Marr said, the crispy hand. Weirdly, that sounds delicious. Kyle Dalton May said, I love potatoes. I mean, the grandma's secret mashed potato recipe. Shane McGlivaka, yum, crispy hand. Diane Corn-Adler said, oh, haha, I thought you said crispy ant. Ray Cersei said, listen to your grandma, you butts. Heather Fairchild said, hey, 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 hey. Ray Cersei said, ew, 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 these hands are freaky. I would agree. Shane Migliavacca said, all this talk of crispy hands is making me hungry. I could go for some. I could eat, you know. Heather Fairchild said, black coffee to go with black sooty hand. Tony Marr said, good story. Not as scary as the crispy hand, but still good. I see what you mean. Yeah, yeah. The story within a story. I really love when the stories have someone telling a campfire story in the story. Meta, meta, meta. Heather Fairchild said, BBQing gone wrong. I mean, or gone right, depending on, you know, what you're persuaded to. Morgan Moore said, this is what happens when Thing tries to cook. Oh, Thing. Oh, gosh. Then Heather Fairchild said, crispy idle hand. That's a good reference. Michelle Antisocial said, you know, this story could have been called The Charred Hand or The Burned Hand, but it wouldn't be as fun and no one would be hungry right now. I mean, you're right. You're right. Perfect titling. Shane Migliavacca, oh, you guys are doomed now. Yep. And then Morgan Moore said, these kids going to end up as side orders. Then Tony Marr said, grandma's attic, mothballs, old newspapers, demonic haunted hand, knickknacks. Yep, nothing out of the ordinary. And then Shane Migliavacca said, quick, throw barbecue sauce on that hand. I mean, you know, you should always have a bottle of barbecue sauce just in case. Especially when you're a growing boy. Morgan Moore said, that was a sprawling and finger-licking good epic. Keith Tomlin said, nice. And then Tony Marr said, scoreboard, one dead kid. Indeed, my friends. So, we're going to read a couple more. It looks like this book, the stories are a little longer than they had been before, which is fine by me. I don't know how long my voice is going to hold out. As always, I will try my best to keep my voice strong enough to go through as many stories as we can handle. And please do consider sending a friendly tip while I read. I do appreciate it very much. Any amount is appreciated. I mean, you guys can get pretty darn generous, and I do appreciate it. But even $1, it just means a lot to me because it means that you're enjoying yourselves a whole heck of a lot. But it's not mandatory. But what I do consider mandatory is hitting share so some other people can maybe join us for some family-friendly frights. So, let's see what the next story is in our final iteration of Scary Stories for Sleepovers. This story is called Where the Buffalo Roam. I knew Marlin from school, but not very well. The other boys who went on the trip with us didn't know at all. I didn't know at all. They were Marlin's cousins and their friends, a few our age, most of them older. The trip was Marlin's father's idea. He owned several businesses, including a dealership that sold motorcycles and all-terrain vehicles. He and his brothers and some friends went by the dealership and borrowed a bunch of four-wheeled ATVs. Then they drove the bikes and us kids way out into the Great Plains, where we could ride and make all the noise we wanted and not disturb a soul. As I said, I didn't even know Marlin that well, so I was surprised when he asked me to go along. We'd been in the same class for years, but I'd never been over to his house, and vice versa. This year, we shared the same lunch period and spent most of the time out on the basketball court. Somehow we ended up on a 3-on-3 team together with Keith Forney, and we clicked. We beat everybody. But that was about the only thing we had in common. For one thing, Marlin smoked. I don't understand why anyone smokes. He doesn't understand what the big deal is. His best friend last year was Julian Johnson, but he was smoking in one of the bathrooms and set a bunch of paper towels on fire in one of the sinks. Julian got expelled for that, and his family moved to another school district. I guess that's how I got to be Marlin's new best friend. There was a vacancy. When he first asked me about going on the trip, I started to think up excuses to get out of it. I mean, Marlin could play basketball, but he was trouble. Hanging out with him for 20 minutes a day while a teacher was watching was one thing. Tagging along with him out in the wilderness where he thought he could get away with anything was another. But then he started talking about the four-wheelers. I had never ridden one before. My parents were more likely to get me a machine gun or a full-grown alligator than an ATV, but I really wanted to ride one. The thought of riding free across the plains, racing under the wide-open sky was just too sweet. I had to say yes. And I thought, who knows, maybe Marlin and I would end up being best friends. We started out Friday afternoon. My mom dropped me off at Marlin's house, which I was a little nervous about. Mom didn't really know anything about Marlin since he'd never been over to our house. She didn't know his reputation for talking back to and swearing at teachers, or about his smoking, or about his suspension for stealing money from the school store. That was no big deal. How would she find out? It wasn't as if there was going to be a sign in the front yard advertising it, but she also didn't know about the ATVs. I had told her we were all just going camping for the weekend. She never would have said yes if she'd known I'd be riding around on a four-wheeler. She didn't know Marlin's parents, so it wouldn't be a problem as long as she didn't see a bunch of ATVs sitting there when she dropped me off. I worried about this on the drive over and practiced in my mind being surprised so I could convince her that I didn't know about them. But it turned out I had nothing to worry about. When we got there, all she saw was a half-dozen men supervising a dozen or so boys in the loading of a couple of vans and pickup trucks. I jumped out. Before I closed the door, Mom told me to have fun. That's exactly what I was planning on doing. I found Marlin playing keep away with some of the others. They had swiped a baseball cap belonging to one of the younger boys and were tossing it around over his outstretched arms. "Hey, Vic!" Marlin called. He threw the cap my way. I caught it and held it in front of me like I was baffled, giving the kid a chance to grab it out of my hands. I always did think that was a mean game. "Sorry," I said as Marlin came over. "No biggie," he said. "Throw your stuff in the red van. That's the one we're riding in. We'll be leaving in another 10 minutes or so." He introduced me to some of the other guys, his cousins and their friends. There were too many names and faces to remember. I just nodded and said, "Hey," and figured I'd sort them out as we went along. We got on the road soon after that and headed over to where Marlin's dad had his dealership. The ATVs were already loaded on trailers. We just had to hook them up to the trucks and vans, and then we were on our way. Marlin's dad and one of his friends rode in the front of the van, and I was in the back with Marlin. Two of his cousins and their friends. One of them had a handheld video game, so we decided to have a football tournament. 2 people could play at once. We played in pairs, and then the winners played to determine the champion. I lost the first game to Marlin. He had a tendency to cheat, pulling the game out of my hands at key moments so I wouldn't tackle his receivers, but but I didn't say anything. I was a guest, and I was going to get to ride an ATV all weekend for free, so I figured the least I could do was let him win one video game. It was dark by the time we got to where we were going. How Marlin's dad knew where we were was a mystery to me. After a couple of hours on the interstate, we drove an hour more on a 2-lane road, then turned off onto a dirt track worn in the prairie grass. We seemed to follow that forever. Out my window, the plains seemed to roll away like a black sea. The only lights that didn't come from our vehicles were the moon and the stars. I had thought we were going to property he owned somewhere, but I overheard Marlin's dad say something to his friend about this being government land. "What if we get caught?" the other man asked. Marlin's dad snorted. "Who's going to catch us? Nobody ever comes out here." It shocked me that we were on land where we weren't supposed to be. I thought maybe I'd heard it wrong. Marlin's dad was an adult. He was supposed to do things by the rules. Then I realized that maybe Marlin was the troublemaker he was because that's the kind of person his father was. I wondered what I'd gotten myself into. Marlin's dad finally stopped the van at a spot that looked just like every other spot we had traveled past over the last 40 minutes. I was just glad the trip was over. Everyone piled out and confusion ruled the darkness for a while until it was decided who was going to sleep where. I learned I was sharing a 4-person tent with Marlin, one of his cousins, and another guy. I helped put up the tent and kept an eye on my backpack. I didn't want it to disappear in the confusion. Marlin's dad dug a shallow pit and started a campfire with wood he'd brought. After everyone had put up their tents and situated their sleeping bags, they gathered by the fire. A couple of coolers of drinks and sandwiches were opened, and we all dug in. I was starved and grabbed 2 sandwiches, not caring what kind they were. Then we all sat around the fire and ate and talked. A few of the guys wanted to take the ATVs out now in the dark. "Not on your lives," Marlin's father said. "I've got to sell those machines. I'm not going to have you out there wrecking them in the dark." One of the men, Mr. Desmond, started telling stories. Ghost stories, cowboy stories, all kinds of stories. Some of the others went off to watch the battery-powered television Marlin's father had brought, or to horse around in the dark. Marlin himself went off with some of the others to sneak a smoke, but I stayed by the fire and listened to Mr. Desmond tell his stories. He told the tale of General Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn, and then another about a haunted riverboat on the Mississippi. He was talking about the Pony Express when 2 boys came up running. "Look what we found in the grass," one of them said, gesturing toward the other. "What do you mean, we?" the second asked. "I found it." With both hands, he held out a stony object, about 8 inches long, and pointed at one end. "You found yourself a flint spearhead," Mr. Desmond told them. "A nice one, too. You see, a couple of 100 years ago, the plains were the domain of the buffalo, or the American bison. When the herds passed through here, they stretched as far as the eye can see. The Native American tribes survived by hunting the buffalo. They ate the meat, used the hides to keep warm, made needles from the bones, fashioned bowstrings from the sinew. They used every part of it. But the herds are gone these days, and most of the tribes with them. You've got yourself a lucky find there, boys. A real piece of history." I had to admit, I was jealous. Maybe tomorrow, I decided, I'd do a little spearhead hunting myself, if I could spare some time from riding my ATV. We woke to the smell of bacon cooking and scrambled out of the tent. The adults had several camp stoves set up, as well as a long table filled with plates, forks, spoons, milk, cereal, scrambled eggs, donuts, orange juice, and any other breakfast stuff. I got in line and filled a plate for myself, still hungry from the night before. After breakfast, we started unloading the ATVs from the trailers and gassing them up. Soon, the coarse growls of their motors shattered the quiet morning. Marlin knew I had never ridden one before and showed me the basics. Throttle, clutch, brake. It wasn't very hard. I practiced around the camp area while they finished gassing up the other bikes. By the time all of us boys were mounted up, I was feeling pretty comfortable driving my ATV. One of Marlin's older cousins waved and then took off, heading away from camp. The rest of us followed, racing each other and jockeying for position. I looked behind me once to see how close the others were, and noticed how the wide tires of our ATVs were mangling the turf, which was damp from the recent rains. Behind us, the muddy ruts we left chased and crossed one another all the way back to camp. At least we won't get lost, I thought, feeling guilty about destroying the perfect stretch of grassy plain. Though the land seemed flat, there were ridges and dips to zoom up and down, but before I knew it, we were completely out of sight of the camp. The others went a little faster than I would have liked, but I didn't want to lose them, so I squeezed the throttle and kept up. I started to space out after a while. The constant racket of the motors made it impossible to hear anything. The wind rushed past as I shot along the sunny plains. This is what I had dreamed of. It was exhilarating, but after a while, it also got to be a little boring. I wondered how far we were going to ride. It was hard to tell what direction we were traveling in. We still seemed to be going straight away from camp. I wondered when we would start to head back. I had no idea how long a tank of gas would last, but we didn't have any gas to spare. Oh, guys, I apologize. Hold on. I hear Chicano. He's doing something unusual. I just need to make sure he's okay. I will be right back, guys. I'm so sorry. Talk amongst yourselves. Okay, hello. Hey guys, sorry about that. I hope I didn't mean to worry anybody. Chicano is totally okay. And no, it wasn't the crispy hand sneaking up on me. So I can start the story again. Chicano was just kind of pacing around and acting a little funny. So I had to make sure he's okay. I tried to get him to come into the room with me. I think he's just a little disoriented. But I'll keep an ear out for him. But he should be okay. So let's get back to the story. Already in progress. I decided I would just have to trust the more experienced riders like Marlin to turn back when it was time. If not, we would have a long walk ahead of us. I followed the others over a low hill without thinking about what might be on the other side. After so many miles of grassy plain, I just expected more of the same, and that's what I found. But there was something else as well. As I passed over the top of the hill, I lifted a bit of my seat out of my seat. I saw something other than the dull brown and green grass. An old Native American man was sitting on a colorful woven blanket. He was big, but his back was hunched over, and he was wearing a robe of what I realized was probably buffalo skin. Two steely gray braids hung down to his lap. His face was etched with creases. He seemed like a statue carved from stone as he watched me head right for him. I managed to stop my ATV and the muck the others had churned up around him. The other riders had stopped, or we were slowly coming back. One of the older cousins wheeled up right in front of the Native American. Everyone was throttling down, and I was right there, so I could hear his words. "You should watch out," Marlin's cousin shouted. "You could get hurt." "You are the ones who need to be more careful," the old man said, though there was no anger in his voice. In fact, a trace of a smile haunted his lips. "Your machines are scarring the earth and drowning out her music." The boy laughed. "She'll get over it. Who owns this land anyway?" The man shook his head solemnly. "No one owns the land, just as no one owns the air, or the water, or the sun." "Yeah, right," the boy said. "Well, here, how about owning some mud?" He gunned his throttle and spun his bike, kicking up mud at the old man as he tore away. The laughter of the others was drowned out by the growing roars of their engines. I was horrified that they would treat anyone this way, especially an old man. I was close enough that by nudging my ATV forward a little, I could get between him and most of them. Mud and turf pelted me and my ATV for several seconds. Then, as the chorus of motors started to fade, I shut off my own bike and turned to the old man. "Are you okay?" The old man smiled at me. I noticed that he was wearing a necklace made from two short, curved buffalo horns braided with a rawhide thong. Better than you, it would seem." I shook off some of the mud. "I'm sorry about them. They're a bunch of jerks. They have no respect for the land, only for their noisy machines," he replied. I suddenly felt self-conscious about sitting on one of those noisy machines myself. I shrugged. "This is my first time on one. I didn't know it would tear up the ground like this." "Do not worry," the old man said. That this concerns you shows you no respect for the land. The Earth Mother knows the difference between those who respect her and those who do not." "Well, thanks," I said, feeling a little less guilty. "Anyway, I'm sorry we disturbed you. It was an honor to meet you." I walked my ATV away from him about 50 feet, not in the direction Marlin and the others had gone, but in the opposite direction. I had my fill of riding with them. After I started my ATV again, I headed back the way we'd come. I stayed in my tracks all the way back, so I would not have to do any more damage to the earth. When I got back to camp, only the adults were there, playing cards under an awning and watching baseball on TV. They barely noticed me. I helped myself to some soda and sandwiches and then wandered off to eat. I wished there was some way I could go home. I should have known going anywhere with Marlin was a bad idea. The others came back about an hour after me, arriving in a thunderous chorus that sounded like the world was ending. They were mud-spattered and were laughing and pushing each other as they abandoned their ATVs to get something to eat. I stayed off by myself until it started to get dark, looking for spearheads and just wanting the weekend to be over. I thought Mr. Desmond might tell more stories, which would help pass the time, but the boys played loud music and set off fireworks, driving the adults inside to play cards. I watched for a little while, glad the ground was so wet. Those idiots wouldn't care if they started a grass fire. Finally, I went to bed. I was awakened early the next morning by the shaking of the ground and a heavy rumble in the air that I could feel on my skin. At first I thought everyone was back on their ATVs already, but this sound was different, and Marlin and the others were still asleep around me. I crawled out of the tent to see what was going on. The sound came from the north. I had to pick my way through camp, which was now a mess of churned mud, littered with empty soda cans, sandwich wrappers, and burned out fireworks. I made my way around a van, and then I could see it. A living carpet sweeping toward us across the plain, stretching from east to west. I didn't know what I was seeing at first, and thought it was one giant world-covering mass. Then I made out the drumming hooves of the individuals in the front, and I knew I was looking at an enormous buffalo herd. It was impossibly big, but here I was looking at it. I ran back to the tent to warn the others. I grabbed Marlin and tried to rouse him, but he groggily told me to go back to sleep. I tried shaking the other boys in the tent. "Get up! There's a herd of buffalo coming!" They laughed sleepily and told me to leave them alone. Meanwhile, the ground trembled under the impact of millions of hooves. I ran back outside and was going to try to wake the adults, but the herd was almost upon us. I could see the wild eyes and foam-flecked muzzles of the bulls in the front. I knew there was no more time. I ran for Marlin's dad's van and scrambled up, climbing over the bumper to the spare tire and then to the roof and threw myself flat. The herd hit the camp like a tidal wave. The tents vanished under a sea of shaggy, humped backs. The noise they made would have drowned out all the ATVs yesterday, and the thick animal scent of them filled the air. I hung on to the top of the van as it rocked under me. After a while, when it seemed as if a million beasts had already rushed past me, I raised myself a little to look to the north to see if the end of the herd was in sight, but the brown sea still stretched to the horizon. I did see something else. A little way from the camp, there was a clear spot in the herd where the buffalo had parted to go around something. Staring, I saw the old Native American from yesterday. He looked back at me for a moment, expressionless. Then he walked on. As he moved among the herd, they continued to part around him, the only object in the plain that commanded respect from the stampeding animals. I was getting hungry, but the herd continued to pass as the sun rose high and then began to settle in the west. As it grew dark, the mighty animals still continued their irresistible journey to the south. I wouldn't have thought I could sleep under such conditions, but finally, long after moonrise, I fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, the herd was gone, and all was calm. Scanning all horizons from my vantage point on top of the van, I saw no trace of the buffalo. I saw no sign of my fellow campers either. The trucks and vans were still there, but the tents, the campfire, and the coolers of food were all gone. The ground that had been littered with trash and churned into mud was as grassy and undisturbed as when we'd arrived. I saw no sign of buffalo tracks. Finally, I jumped down from the top of the van where I had sought refuge for the last 24 hours. I moved to where my tent had been and combed my fingers through the grass. Nothing was there. Not the slightest bit of stuffing from a torn sleeping bag. Not any sign of Marlin and the others. I went to the other vehicles and checked inside. There was no one else. No other survivor. I was alone. I did find some food in the van and wolfed it down, starved after a full day without eating. Then I climbed back on top of the van to take a better look around. There must be something left, I thought. A scrap of cloth in the grass, maybe. I looked all around in every direction for some telltale glimpse of color in the green-brown grass. But there was none. All that was left were the vans and trucks and a single ATV parked a dozen yards from camp on the dirt track that had led us there. I frowned at the muddy red machine, recognizing it as one I had been riding 2 days before. That's not where I'd left it, and I did not understand how it could be standing over there by itself, intact, when all the others had disappeared. I climbed down from the van and went over to investigate. It was my ATV, all right, and the key was still in it. The gas tank read full, and hanging from the handlebars was a necklace of raw hide braided around 2 short, curved buffalo horns, the same necklace the old man had been wearing. His words came back to me. The Earth Mother knows the difference between those who respect her and those who do not. I climbed on the ATV, slipped the necklace over my head, and started the bike. Then I headed back the way we had come, following the dirt track across the open majesty of the Great Plains. That was pretty good. I mean, talk about vicious. Wow. Talk about vicious. The kids get get trampled so viciously you can't even hear them because you know, the beasts are too loud. That was something. All right, let's get a little water going. Voice is getting a little tired. Let's see what you guys are saying in the chat. Thank you very much, Keith Tomlin, for your tip. I really do appreciate it, my friend. And then let's see what you guys are saying. Keith Tomlin said, friends are overrated. That's fair. Shane Migliavacca said, any tales of crispy appendages, Mr. Desmond? That would have been a good tie-in. He could have told the tale of the crispy hand. Tony Moore, so, how's everyone's evening? Oh, yeah, that must have been when I stepped away. These crickets are soothing. Crispy hands, am I right? You guys are funny. You guys are funny. Heather Fairchild, feels like we're about to watch some kind of Joe Bob with these crickets. I hope Chicano's okay. He's totally fine. He hasn't made any more sounds. If he does, you know, I'll check on him, but I think he's okay. It's just, my dogs are pretty quiet. You know, Henwolf likes to groan and snore, but like, when I heard Chicano doing something over and over and over again, it freaked me out a little bit, because it's just really unusual. So, Keith Tomlin said Chicano needs to learn to handle his high. I mean, he's not wrong. Morgan Moore said, so these kids are dead. And then Shane Migliavacca said, yep, dead kids incoming. And then Tony Marr said, Marlin is definitely voting for Trump if he's not dead. Dang. All right. Scoreboard update, 6 dead kids, 6 dead adults. Craig Cohen, wow, I like that one a lot. Stampede horror. Keith Tomlin said, moral of the story, don't be a jerk to an old Native American or you will get buffalo up your butt. Words to live by. Well, let's see. Okay, I say I've got one more to do because I want to save the other half of this book for next week. So we'll do one more and then we'll all chill out for the night. And I can, my plan as soon as this is over is to jump on the couch with Chicano and pretty much snuggle him the rest of the night. So, you know. Yeah, so, let's do it. Ooh, okay. Well, okay, folks. We've been talking about food so much, I have a feeling, a suspicion that maybe this story might make you hungry too. This story is called Attack of the Munchies. Randy knew he would just die if he didn't get to see Night of the Demon Beasts 2. He was at his friend Ed's house for the first time. He was at his friend Ed's house the first time he saw the preview on TV. The two were supposed to be doing homework, but they turned the TV down low so Ed's parents wouldn't hear while they watched World War Wrestling. Sergeant Splat had just taken out Pato the Killer Panda with a folding chair. Randy was turning away to take a drink from his can of soda when he heard the familiar Demon Beast theme song, and he froze. Ed started to say something, but Randy shushed him and pressed closer to the small screen so he wouldn't miss a word. The people of Millersburg think their streets are safe, a somber voice intoned as the screen showed a quiet street late at night, with nice homes and big trees and bikes parked casually on nice lawns. 1 year ago, a few teenagers stopped an invasion of infernal creatures bent on killing every man, woman, and child in town, and now they think the terror is over. A monstrous shadow rose from behind one of the parked cars. They could not be more wrong. A guitar screamed, and then the theme music played frantically as a sequence of frightened people in a variety of scenes blurred by too quickly to make out clearly. With a final glimpse of the quiet street, now alive with moving shadows, the chilling voice said, Night of the Demon Beasts 2, Dark Migration, starts Friday at a theater near you. Ooh, I gave myself goosebumps. Whoa, Randy breathed. We have to see that, Ed said. We have to. Randy nodded, still staring at the television even though the preview had been replaced by a cola commercial. "The first night of the Demon Beast is my all-time favorite movie," he murmured. "Mine too," Ed replied, "but I never got to see it at the theater because it was rated R and my mom and dad wouldn't take me. I had to wait until it came out on video." Randy shook his head. "It's not the same on video. Movies like this you have to see in a big screen in a dark theater." Ed frowned at his friend. "You saw the first Demon Beasts on the big screen? Really? How?" "My Uncle Ray took me. He's really cool. He'll let me see whatever I want, and we just tell my mom and dad we went to see something else." "Oh yeah?" Ed said. "I remember you talking about him. He lives in Chicago, doesn't he?" "Right, but he comes to visit every few months, and he's coming this weekend. He'll take me to see Demon Beasts too, no problem." Ed sat up. "Do you think your uncle would let me come?" Randy shrugged. "Sure, like I said, he's really cool." "All right!" They high-fived and Randy said, "Demon Beasts, here we come!" Randy managed to videotape the TV commercial later that evening, and by Friday morning he had watched it dozens of times. He was so hyped about going to see the movie that he didn't know how he was going to make it through the school day. Then, disaster struck. The phone rang while he was eating breakfast. Even though she didn't say much, his mom's expression told him it was bad news. He just didn't know how bad until she hung up. "That was your Uncle Ray," she said. "The transmission's gone out in his car, so he's not able to come over." Randy tried to fend off the disappointment. "Can't he get another car? Or maybe we can go pick him up and bring him here?" His mom looked at him as if he had sprouted antlers. "It's 4 hours each way. Look, Randy, I know you were all worked up to go see that new Disney movie. I'll tell you what, your father and I'll take you instead. It'll be a fun family night. What do you say?" Randy's disappointment turned to dread. The Disney movie was just a cover. He and Uncle Ray were really seeing Night of the Demon Beast Part 2. Randy didn't think he could bear to sit through some stupid Disney movie while the masterpiece of horror he really wanted to see was playing in the next theater. But he couldn't tell his mom that. All he could say was, "Great, Mom. That sounds great." On top of everything else, Randy was going to have to let Ed down Ed. The whole way to school, he dreaded seeing his friend, not wanting to deliver the bad news. But instead of avoiding him, Randy decided just to get it over with. "Hey," Ed said when he spotted his friend, "all set to see Return of the Demon Beasts?" He started stalking around like a demon beast on the prowl and then noticed his friend's lack of enthusiasm. "What's wrong?" "We can't go," Randy told him. "My uncle's stupid car broke down and he's not coming, so now I have to go to some stupid Disney movie with my mom and dad instead." "Really?" Ed turned to his locker distractedly. This wasn't the reaction Randy had been expecting. Where were the outrage and moaning and other expressions of disappointment? "Sorry," Randy said. Ed closed his locker. He still didn't look at all upset. In fact, he looked pretty cheerful. "Don't worry about it," he said. "I have an idea. After your lunch period, meet me by the custodian's room, okay?" Randy was too surprised to do anything else other than agree. Randy didn't wait for the end of his lunch period to meet Ed. He was too curious. As soon as he finished eating, he headed for the custodian's room. The door to the concrete-floored room was open. From the hall, Randy could see the racks of mops and brooms, utility sinks, a tool bench under a display of hanging tools, and the lawnmowers and other equipment he used to maintain the school grounds. He saw no sign of the custodians, who must have been at lunch. Randy waited around 10 minutes before Ed appeared. He was carrying his book bag, and he seemed excited. "So what's going on?" Randy asked. "Quick, in here," Ed said, ushering his friend into the custodian's room. Randy felt a thrill of fear and excitement being in a place where no kids were allowed. Ed led him across the concrete floor and past the covered lawnmowers to a steel garage-type door. Past it was a regular door made of flat metal with no window. "Where are we going?" Randy whispered. "To the movies," Ed answered with a mischievous calculated grin. He opened the door and Randy found himself looking outside into the bright afternoon. Beyond a small patch of asphalt parking lot and a dumpster was the field behind the school and the traffic on Locust Street. "Ditch class?" Randy asked, horrified by how much trouble they could get in. Ed nodded enthusiastically. "The demon beasts are waiting." But it's still rated R. We'll never get in." "No problem," Ed assured him. "I've been talking to Rodney Severs. He's the one who told me we could sneak out after school through the custodian's room at lunchtime. He told me how we can get into the movie, too." Randy was shocked. Rodney Severs got into more trouble than anyone else in this class, but he also knew that Rodney got away with causing trouble 10 times as often as he got caught. If anyone would know the best way to ditch class and sneak into a movie, it was Rodney. "So what do you say?" Ed asked. "I don't know. I mean, we could get in a lot of trouble." "So what? So your parents won't take you to see the Disney movie tonight? Who cares? What's it gonna be? Disney or the Demon Beasts?" Put that way, it wasn't much of a choice. Still, Randy was worried that they would get caught and be punished. "I don't have my jacket," he said. Ed reached into his book bag and pulled out Randy's Green Bay Packers jacket. "Good thing I know your locker combo." Randy was out of excuses, and he suddenly recalled his excitement while watching the commercial for Night of the Demon Beast Part 2. He had to see that movie. "Let's go." After crossing the field behind the school, they had only a short walk into town to the Walnut Hill Theater, with its 6 wonderful screens. As they continued to walk, Ed explained the plan. "All we have to do is buy tickets for some other movie, one that isn't R-rated. Then we sneak from that theater to the one where Night of the Demon Beast 2 is playing." "That's Rodney's great plan?" Randy scoffed. "Just switch theaters?" "Hey, it works," Ed replied defensively. "And Rodney said it's even easier to do during the daytime. There aren't as many ushers and they don't pay as much attention as they do at night. He said you just have to watch out for the manager. He doesn't like kids much." Randy knew exactly who Ed was talking about. As long as Randy had been going to the movies at Walnut Hill, the manager had always been there, hunched awkwardly in his buttoned sport coat as if his body were somehow unnaturally twisted. His combed back hair was bone white, and his shaggy eyebrows were the same shade. "Give me an excuse," those eyes said, "and you'll never know what hit you." "Yeah," Randy agreed. "We should watch out for him." By the time they reached the theater, Randy was torn between his rabid desire to see Night of the Demon Beast 2 and his fear of getting caught by the theater manager. But Ed showed no signs of nervousness. He chatted on and on about how cool the movie was going to be. Randy couldn't wimp out in front of his friend, so he tried to ignore his fears and focus on having a good time. The front ticket windows were closed, with a sign telling patrons to purchase their tickets inside at the concession stand. Ed and Randy entered and found the lobby as deserted as Randy had ever seen it. The video games showed exciting previews to no one, and the long velvet ropes corralled non-existent crowds. The only people there were 2 teenage girls behind the concession counter. Even the popcorn machine was quiet. But the place was filled with the smell of the movies, and despite his nervousness, Randy felt a familiar excitement just being there. He was so flustered, he almost requested a ticket for Night of the Demon Beasts 2, but Ed jumped in and corrected him in time, requesting tickets to the Disney movie for each of them. "You guys better hurry," the girl told them. "The lights just went down." The other girl tore their tickets and directed them down the corridor to the correct theater. Ed and Randy headed in that direction. The corridor held the entrances to 3 theaters. The second was showing the Disney movie. The third, Randy saw, with a surge of excitement, was showing Night of the Demon Beasts 2. "We've got it made," Randy said, heading for the third theater. But Ed grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the closed doors to the second theater. "Not yet," he said. "Demon Beast doesn't start for another 15 minutes. We don't want to sneak in until the lights go down so we don't get caught." As they reached the second theater, the doors opened. The manager emerged, his eyes locking on them instantly, and Randy's blood froze in his veins. The 3 of them stood, staring at one another for a second. Randy felt the weight of those eyes. "Give me an excuse." and wondered how much of their conversation the man had heard. Randy struggled to clear his throat, but it felt too narrow to allow him to swallow. Finally, the manager spoke. "You're late. Show's already started." He shifted to the side so the boys could enter. As he held the door open, Ed went first and Randy followed. As he passed the manager close enough to touch, he had a wild fear that the man would reach out and grab him. But then he was inside the dark theater. The doors swung closed behind them with the manager on the other side. "That was close," Ed muttered. He and Randy stood in the darkness as previews played on the screen. The theater was about half full, mostly with little kids and their moms. When their eyes had adjusted to the dimness, they found seats at the back of the theater so they could exit quickly when the time came. They waited, with Ed sneaking quick looks at his watch every couple of minutes. Finally, he whispered, "We really got lucky." "Tell me about it," Randy said. "I thought the manager was going to grab us for sure." "No, I mean we're lucky that this theater is right next to the one where Demon Beast 2 is playing. Only the matinee show is playing there. They don't use that theater very much." Now that he mentioned it, Randy knew exactly what his friend was talking about. In the many times he had come to the movies there, the sign for the third theater had almost always been blank. "As long as they're using it today," Randy said, "that's what counts." When the time came to switch theaters, Randy's nervousness was starting to get the better of him again. He was also beginning to get into the Disney movie, but he was going to see it tonight with his parents anyway. So when Ed tapped him on the arm and stood to leave, Randy followed. They slipped out the theater doors and found the corridor vacant. Ed rushed toward the last theater, where the matinee of Night of the Demon Beast 2 was playing, but Randy grabbed his arm and stopped him. "Wait, what if the manager is in there, like he was in the other theater?" Ed looked doubtful for a moment, as if he had not considered that possibility. Then he shrugged. "We'll say we had to go to the bathroom and accidentally walked into the wrong theater." Randy had to admit that was a pretty good plan, and he followed his friend. They opened the door to the darkened theater and stepped inside. The previews playing on the screen provided enough light for them to see that they were all alone in the theater, except for one man who ignored them as he ate popcorn. Ed led Randy down the center aisle almost all the way to the front and then made his way to the middle of the third row. The seats were the old-fashioned kind that folded closed like the jaws of a crocodile when you tried to stand up. "Sit down low," Ed said, demonstrating, "so if the manager looks in here, he won't see our heads." Randy slid down in the seat next to Ed and finally allowed himself to relax a little. They were here in the theater. All they had to do was escape notice for the next couple of hours, and they were in the clear, except for one thing, Randy groaned. "What's wrong?" Ed asked. "I have to go to the bathroom," Randy said. He hadn't gone all day. With all the stress of ditching school and sneaking into the theater, he hadn't noticed, but now he had to go and he couldn't hold out for long. "Well, you better go now and go fast if you don't want to miss the start of the movie," Ed advised. Randy dreaded leaving the safe darkness of the theater for the revealing lights of the lobby, but he had no choice. He stood and stared and started to make his way past the vacant seats to the aisle. "Wait a second," Ed whispered. Randy looked back and found his friend holding out a folded $5 bill. "As long as you're going to the lobby, get me a large popcorn and a soda. The smell of that guy's popcorn is giving me the munchies." The thought of spending any more time in the lobby than he had to made Randy cringe. It would only increase his chances of running into the manager, but he didn't want to look like a chicken in front of Ed, so he took the bill and hurried from the theater. The corridor outside was still vacant. He crossed the lobby to the restrooms and saw only the two girls behind the counter. He used the restroom and then returned to the concession counter to buy Ed's popcorn and soda. One girl filled his order while the other took his money, so the transaction took only half a minute. He headed back to the theater with the popcorn in one hand and the soda in the other. Still no sign of the manager, he turned as if to enter the second theater just in case, but at the last minute darted to the third entrance. A half-dozen pieces of popcorn tumbled to the floor as he maneuvered the door open. Then he was back in the comfortable darkness of the theater. The movie had already started, but the opening credits were still playing, so he hadn't missed much. The man with popcorn was gone, he noticed, as he made his way down to the front. He hadn't seen anyone else in the lobby. The man must have left while Randy was in the restroom. Maybe the demon beasts were too much for him. As Randy moved down to the aisle, he scanned the rows of empty seats for Ed's silhouette, but he reached the front of the theater without seeing his friend. He counted back 3 rows, but still could see no sign of his friend. He slipped into the 3rd row, spilling more popcorn, and made his way toward the center of the theater, where they'd been sitting. "Ed?" he whispered. He suddenly realized that his friend was probably playing a joke, and it made him angry. "This isn't funny. You're gonna get us caught." He thought that would make his friend emerge, but there was still no sign of Ed. Then he noticed something moving back by the main aisle where he'd spilled the popcorn. A shadow flickered, and then the popcorn was gone. He jerked away in surprise, spilling more popcorn. It fell on the seats in front of him, but instead of it getting caught between the folded cushions, as he would have expected, the seats snapped it up like hungry young robins at feeding time. As they did, Randy caught a glimpse of the black mouths filled with jagged teeth and flicking tongues. He staggered away from them in fright, spilling popcorn everywhere. All around him the seats thrashed and chewed, and then long, warty tongues like black tentacles came forth in search of more. Randy dropped the soda and popcorn bucket and climbed over the first 2 rows of seats to the front of the theater. The seats chomped at him as he climbed over them, but he moved with a speed fueled by terror. He reached the front of the theater and pressed himself to the wall. Right above him, the movie played over the screen, and he had to shield his eyes against its brightness. As he peered into the darkness, he could see that the theater was alive with tentacle tongues probing, searching for more food. With a horror that made him cry out, he suddenly realized what must have happened to Ed and to the man with the popcorn. The tongues searched the theater floor, but didn't come near him. He seemed to be safe for the moment, but they also blocked his only path for escape. Then, a light showed at the other end of the theater as the doors opened. A familiar, dreaded figure peered in, but Randy was desperate. "Help!" he called to the manager. Even from that distance, he could feel the disturbing weight of the man's gaze. For a moment, Randy was afraid he was going to leave and abandon him to his fate, but then the manager flicked on a flashlight and moved confidently down the center aisle. Where the flashlight beam touched, the tentacle tongues retreated with the speed of snapped rubber bands. He stopped about halfway down the aisle. "Got you trapped, do they?" he asked. He shined the light down to the floor at the front of the theater, clearing the area right in front of Randy. "Just follow the light on the floor. Just follow the light on the floor. They don't like light. That's why they wouldn't get you up by the screen. It's too bright for them." Randy did as the man said, moving safely to the foot of the aisle in the circle of light. "What are they?" Randy asked quietly, as if afraid that speaking too loudly would provoke an attack. The manager shrugged. "I'm not really sure," he said. "They just sort of showed up here a few years ago. Maybe some alien creature that mimics movie seats to catch fallen candy and popcorn? Something that evolved here in the darkness of the theater?" As Randy continued to follow the circle of lights on the floor, the manager backed up the aisle towards the door. "They're dormant when the house lights are on," the manager said. "But once the lights go down and the movie begins, they awaken." Just outside the circle of light, the tentacle tongues twisted and thrashed, as if frustrated by the nearness of food they couldn't get to. The manager reached the doors when Randy was about halfway up the aisle. "But if you know about them," Randy said, "why don't you tell someone?" The manager grinned, and his teeth reminded Randy of the glimpse he had of the teeth in the seats. "Why would I want to do that? These creatures, whatever they are, leave the theater neat and clean. These things are a theater manager's dream. As far as I'm concerned, they're right where they ought to be. You, on the other hand, sneaked into the wrong theater, my friend." He flicked off the flashlight. As he slipped out of the theater, Randy heard him say, "Enjoy the show." On the screen, a girl hiding in a dark forest screamed as the demon beasts closed in. Randy, feeling something wrap around his ankle in the darkness, added his voice to hers. I was not expecting man-eating movie theater. All right. I mean, after 10 books, they're still surprising me, folks. Let's see what you kids are saying. Oh, man, my throat is so dry. Okay. All right. Shane Migliavaca said, what's with food in this volume? I don't know, but I don't hate it. Morgan Moore said, munchies, munchos. Yum. Oh, man. I want a bag of munchos so bad. Tony Marr, I mean, a crispy hand made me hungry. Doesn't take much. And then Morgan Moore said, preach it, kid, in regards to seeing horror flicks in the theater. Dude, I almost got a tear in my eye about the joys of being in a big dark room with a big screen movie. I miss the movies a lot. I do. Keith Tomlin said, Packers fan. Pff, hope he dies. But to be fair, I would have said that for any team, for any sport. Oh, Keith, your desire for child death in these stories knows no bounds. So I think that's going to be it for the night. The chat's saying that that's all there is in there. I know the chat can be a little weird. Okay, we're good. My friends, I think we're going to call it a night for tonight. I want to let you know, next week, we will be reading the remainder of Scary Stories for Sleepovers number 10, the final book in the series. We've read 9 other books. I do also have this short book, the Scary Stories for Sleepovers Almanac. I might read that at some point. It's supposed to have true ghost stories in it. But next week, we'll be finishing up the book, and then I will probably be taking a break from Scary Stories readings for a little while. Maybe for a couple weeks, maybe for a month. I've done a whole lot of them in a row, and I have a really good time with it, but I think I need a little bit of time to recuperate. Also, I may have a big surprise to announce in the not-too-distant future involving Uncle Henny's Campfire Stories, some fun stuff we're going to be doing. So, next week is going to be our season finale, I guess. So please do your best to be right here at 8 o'clock Eastern. Tell some friends, gather some friends. If you got little children, gather them up. We'll listen to some scary stories, probably about oddly satisfying sounding food, and we'll have a great time together. So thank you guys again so much for hanging out with me. I really do appreciate it. Stay safe, stay sane, stay well, and I will catch you next week. Thank you again, guys.